Remember, language hasn't evolved at all for 50,000 years since humans left Africa. A small group left Africa, spread all over the world, and we're all basically identical. If you take an infant from an Amazonian tribe that hasn't had other human contact for 20,000 years and bring it up in Baltimore, it'll speak straight Baltimore English, end up here studying physics, and conversely. So there doesn't seem to be, there are individual differences among humans, but there don't seem to be any significant or almost detectable group differences. So nothing's happened for about 50,000 years. And if you go back about 50,000 years before that, there isn't really any evidence that there was language. In that, of course, we're beyond, as I said, you don't have comparative evidence, you don't have fossil evidence, but you do have artifacts. And in fact, there was a big kind of creative explosion that took place somewhere in that window, let's say maybe 35,000 years ago. A sudden explosion of symbolic representation, complex social structures, observations, apparent observations of astronomical events, all kinds of things just suddenly happened. In general, it's usually assumed, we don't have direct evidence, that this must have been connected with this sudden emergence of language. And notice that it's very sudden in evolutionary times. Now, you can double or triple the numbers. It's still a flick of an eyelash in evolutionary time. So somewhere in a very small window, something happened, and then nothing happened afterwards. That part we're pretty sure of. Well, what would have happened? Whatever happened, unless there's some mechanism that biology hasn't discovered yet, whatever happened would be some rewiring of the brain, some mutation that caused a rewiring of the brain. And that rewiring of the brain would have given this mechanism, this computational mechanism that allows these things to happen. But a rewiring of the brain, a mutation takes place in an individual, not in a group. Okay, that's obvious. So this happened to somebody, some person in some small hunter-gatherer group underwent this change. That person had the capacity to do what we all do internally, but without the externalization, because there was nobody to talk to. So there's no reason to think it was externalized at all. It's just that whatever is going on in our heads that is pre-linguistic, that we get bits and pieces of it when we think about, that would have been available for one person. Well, if there's any selective advantage to that, say ability to plan and so on, it could proliferate in a small group there over generations. There could be enough people who had that, so it would make some sense to interact. But then at that point you would get externalization. But externalization is a very tough process. There's this internal thing in the head which developed without any external pressures, okay, because there were no selectional pressures on it, almost by definition. So it's kind of like a snowflake, something that just develops because that's the way nature works. You have this thing in the head, you have a sensory motor system which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years and has nothing to do with it, and you have to match them up. That's a complicated process. And in fact, that's where practically, as far as we know, that's where almost all the complexity of language is. When you learn a language, that's what you learn. A child who's acquiring a language, that's what they acquire. Nobody teaches you, you don't learn the kinds of things I mentioned at the beginning, which are probably just part of the way the snowflake works. And then of course, once you have the externalization, you could have some kind of communication. So, even from the minimal evolutionary speculation, and of course it's all speculation, it looks like a plausible scenario. It incidentally has looked that way to some of the leading evolutionary biologists too. It's hard to think of an alternative, in fact. So yeah, it does kind of sound intuitive that that people ought to be communicating all the time. What else do they need language for? But like a lot of obvious things, when you look at it, it just doesn't seem to be true.